Um, so Caroline mentioned the what Mapping England was originally for. I'm just going to update what this is and what it was intended to do. So the last State of the Sector report for England was in 2014. On the right-hand side there, we've had a more recent report from Scotland, a more of an omnibus report there, but nothing for England. Mapping England is an updated this to some extent. It's a large report, and it's comprising ongoing research about community transport, really with the aim of providing an overview of the sector for those who are new to it, so providing an understanding of what community transport is, the variety of different organisations that comprise community transport, and also providing up-to-date evidence to decision makers to inform policy development. We have a large policy programme within CTA, so we want to make sure that we have up-to-date information. We have detailed information about the sector that we can use, so that decisions are informed by this type of data. It also provides us at the CTA with insight on the key issues faced by the sector. So, as I mentioned, to inform policy work, but also to inform support for the sector. It's not just the policy that's informed by this particular piece of work. And hopefully for community transport operators, all of the groups who've kindly volunteered their time to provide an input into this research, this will be a source of evidence and an understanding of their fit within the sector, but also a sort of starting point, so we can sort of compare their own areas to the national picture. In terms of what we did, this research is a mixture of primary data collection, secondary data analysis, and desktop research of secondary research. So it's a sort of mixed methodology that we've used. The main method that we've used really is analysis of the survey that we did, permit records, and also of various other types of nationally available statistics. It was designed with a stakeholder group, as Caroline mentioned, and in collaboration with all 4 countries in the CTA. So what we wanted to do with the survey itself was make sure that we had questions that we could repeat, and also the questions that could enable a comparison across Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and England, the 4 CTA countries. We had invitations to survey issued to members at the end of last year, and we kept the survey open into spring of this year, and promoted via newsletters, social media channels through CTA events. Lots of people were promoting the survey, and as a result we got 302 organisations returning the survey, 201 making it all the way through, and as a sort of benchmark, we have 734 new current or pending community transport members. That's not including public bodies and schools. So we got a good chunk of the membership replying to this survey and provided data for it. In terms of how representative the response was, I won't go into detail of that, but detail in the report. But we're broadly happy that it represents a CTA membership with a slight overrepresentation in the Southwest Peninsula, which is one of the CTA areas, and a slight underrepresentation of groups at the lower and upper end of the income scale, and I'll discuss that a little bit more in terms of what those groups are. But yeah, as a whole, we're happy with the representation of the results, and so we're confident that this presents a good overview of what the sector looks like in England. So I'm not going to go through lots of graphs today. Those of you who saw the interim results will have known that there are an awful lot of graphs in the report, and lots of good stuff for people who like that to get their teeth into. But obviously we have a relatively limited time today, and also we want to sort of focus on the key areas. So what I'm going to do is come up with cover three main areas that the results fit into, 3 main themes, and then I'm going to go into the CTA manifesto areas, which are the policy areas that we'll be working on going forward, what the results mean for those particular areas, and what it can tell us about actions that we should be taking as an organisation, and that and the policymakers need to consider as issues for the community transport sector. So what did we find? So the first thing that we find is not necessarily a shocking thing, but it's an important thing to consider, is that we had a wide variety of different organisations replying under the banner of community transport. So we have an extremely diverse sector. So that manifests itself in terms of different types of incomes. So we have a wide range of incomes. So Quarter had an income of under 25k a year, so extremely small, generally volunteer staffed organisations. And then sort of, as I mentioned, we had a slight underrepresentation at the top end of the scale of organisations with an income of over 1 million. But we still had a good chunk of those groups responding. What we found is that secondary purpose organisations tended to have the largest income, so tended to be in that 1 million plus bracket. When I say secondary and primary purpose, by the way, through this presentation, what I'm referring to is whether transport is the secondary or primary purpose of the organisation. So community transport organisation is generally a primary purpose one if it's set up for that, but a secondary purpose may be providing transport to support its other charitable functions. In actual fact, the secondary purpose organisations, although they had the largest incomes, in many cases weren't devoting the full income that they received to community transport. So on average, secondary purpose organisations were devoting around 28% of their income to community transport. The second part of the diversity of the sector is that organisations do not deliver one type of service. On average, primary purpose CTO, i.e. an organisation with transport as its key purpose, was delivering 3 different types of services. And group hire, voluntary car schemes and Dial-A-Ride were the most popular. Those were also the most popular in the 2014 scheme, but the places have changed slightly, so that Dial-A-Ride was the 3rd most popular there. On the left-hand side, you can see a chart there which splits by the focus of the service, so urban and rural services. And what that shows really is the kind of the popularity of the different types of services, but also that certain services are more popular amongst rural schemes, and certain services are more popular amongst urban-based schemes or predominantly urban-based schemes. So what you can see there, volunteer car schemes, and community bus services and medication prescription shopping collection services are very much dominated by rural organisations, whereas some of the urban organisations are more likely to be in day hopper out and about bus trips, or self-hire without a driver. So there's some difference there in terms of the focus of services, and that fits very much into the kind of diversity of the sector. And the idea, I think, that we see through these results, that the community transport organisations are very much adapting to the environment in which they are operating and the passengers that they have. And so it's the diversity of type of service is very much a product of the diversity of the type of demand. The third point there, over 34,000 Section 19 permits were issued in England in the past 5 years, more 800 Section 22 permits. Those are our Office of Traffic Commissioner figures, and it shows the real scale of permits. Not all of those will be recognised community transport organisations. A lot are local authorities, some organisations operating through group hire, etc. And but it does illustrate the large portion of permits that are issued in England, and how much coverage the sector has. And finally, there's a wide variety of vehicle types to fit the service. So environment and user. What we saw was the domination, I'll go into this a little bit more detail later on, of minibuses, as you might expect, and multi-person vehicles. But most of the groups had a number of different types of vehicles as well. So the fleet themselves are quite diverse. The further aspects of the diversity of the sector, nearly all CTOs were carrying older passengers. So I think it's around about 90% of CTOs were carrying older passengers. The main ones that weren't were generally youth groups, and the majority were also taking disabled people with a range of conditions. However, that's not the full story. Half of CTOs were also taking children, 2/5 carrying youth groups, and a third transporting students. So there is a diversity of passenger types within the sector, and that's related to the types of services that are being provided. But there is also a specialism there for accessible transport, and this is one of the key strengths of the sector, as we know it, that CTOs are specialists in being able to transport passengers who are unable to access other forms of transport, and that experience and expertise is what enables those passengers to travel. In terms of journey purposes, social, shopping, and health-related journey purposes were the most popular, but education, arts, and sports still feature for at least a third. So there's a large different types of journeys being carried for, by the organisations, but yeah, the social, shopping, and health-related journey purposes were the most popular. Health-related journeys we'll come back to in a bit, because there's a strong relationship with the policy section of the survey here. On average, CTOs had 4 different sources of income, rising to 5 different sources of income for primary purpose organisations and falling for 3 for secondary purpose organisations. So there's a diversity in funding, which is good, because on the right hand side, what you can see is a graph with the sources of funding, showing that over 3/4 were receiving grants, and this, when you look at the top sources of funding in terms of the amount of income received, grants is a hugely important source of funding for the sector. But equally, there's very many other forms of income which are useful for diversity of income. And there's also a variable take-up of technology. So most of your larger groups take up journey planning software, email bookings, etc. But there's a wide range of systems used. The take-up generally is variable. So the second theme really is we've found a wide reach of for community transport organisations. There's obviously the response and the membership mapping shows a huge coverage for organisations, and we also asked organisations to provide details of their trips. Now this is a very much a sort of top level view of trips, and there's certain caveats in the report about this, but essentially CTOs were transporting over 13 million passengers annually, and on over 5.8 million vehicle trips. So the characteristics of those trips differed by environment. So what we saw was that rural CTOs tend to make fewer, longer journeys with fewer passengers, compared to urban CTOs who pick up more passengers but travel a shorter distance. And obviously that's a product of environment, that rural areas are more dispersed, and it also sort of shows the importance of rural services in terms of filling in, because that kind of dispersion of demand is something that frequently leads to other alternative transport not being available. We saw that community transport is affordable, that 43% of the trips made were not charged to passengers, either due to concessionary fares covered by membership. So that's an important consideration for making this form of transport accessible. And we saw that vehicles were accessible, so 3/4 of 9 to 16 persons minibuses and 4/5 of MPVs were classed as wheelchair accessible. So there are some issues that we're going to talk about with vehicles later on, but in terms of accessibility, that high level of vehicle accessibility, which is important to note. So community transport volunteers also bring additional value to the sector. So factoring up the responses to the CTA membership, there are around 15,800 volunteers for the year surveyed, and two volunteers for every one paid position. So there's a huge amount of additional value being brought in by those volunteers who are devoting their time, and even a number of full-time volunteers within that group. And finally, what we saw is a wide reach, but we also saw that demand is increasing. So 83% have an increased demand for service in the past year, and this has links to some of the service priorities that we'll look at in a second. We asked survey respondents about their priorities for the coming year, and what we found was three main issues that were coming up again and again and again. So the three largest priorities were recruitment. 67% were concerned that they might not have sufficient volunteers to meet the rising demand for their services, and 37% of organisations have seen a decline in volunteer recruitment in the previous year. So there's a definite issue regarding volunteer recruitment. This is an issue that's raised in our manifesto, and I'll discuss some of the details of this shortly. But staff recruitment and diversity of recruitment were also issues. So diversity of recruitment in particular has issues around age and also gender. It wasn't just volunteers, but recruitment of volunteers was a dominant issue. Funding and finance was the second most important issue, or the second key issue raised. So we saw that CTOs have a diverse range of incomes, but 81% were still reliant on grants for the lion's share of their funds, i.e. in the top three of their income sources. Moreover, 62% were receiving funds from local authorities, and obviously in the current climate, with local authority finances being what they are, that is a concern. And in a separate poll, 60% of those with local authority funding expected some level of cut in the current year. So there are definite issues with that reliance on grant funding, that reliance on local authority funding in particular, and the potential knock-on effects from local authority funding cuts. The rising cost of living also had an impact for costs related to vehicles, and we've seen a large increase in the cost of motoring, both in terms of fuel, insurance, and maintenance costs, as well as issues around rents and premises, and to some extent staff wages. And the final area raised was with vehicles, specifically replacing new vehicles. So what we've seen so far is that the community transport fleet's accessible, but what we also saw was that it's aging in many cases. So over 2/5 of diesel vehicles were Euro 5 or older, which is 2015 or before. And that has implications, firstly, for things like clean air zones, where those vehicles would be chargeable if community transport did not have an exemption, which in most cases it does currently, but also has a longer term implication in terms of reliability, in terms of cost of running, finding parts, and passenger comfort, and so on. So there are quite a few older vehicles that but are still in operation, and a number of organisations said that they wanted to replace these. What we also saw is that funding for the new vehicles is complex and takes time to achieve particularly for a lot of smaller organisations. For larger ones, we saw more of a transition to lease buying in some cases, but certainly for the smaller organisations, there was a need to have more than one source of income to purchase a vehicle, and 71% needed charitable grants to purchase a new vehicle. So there's a definite sort of complexity to being able to purchase that new bus. 42% last purchased a vehicle more than 3 years ago, which illustrates how difficult it is. And the majority, and as I say, the majority we use more than one source to secure funds. So the next section, I'm just going to go through the manifesto areas and just give you a little snapshot of some of the results as they apply to the 5 areas that we're focusing our policy work on, and also some of the things that we're looking to do as a result of these findings. So we have the first area is modernisation for growth. So some of the key areas which were in this section, of the manifesto, relate to the D1 driving license entitlement, which remains a critical issue for CTOs and is supported by the results from this survey. So what we found is 31% of volunteer drivers don't have D1, i.e. they only have B category licenses. Of those who do hold D1, 65% hold this entitlement through grandfather rights, i.e. having qualified for their license prior to 1997. What we know from analysis of driving licenses is that a fifth of the total number of D1 licenses will be lost in the next 5 years due to the majority of people holding D1 being in the sort of mid-40s to age 70 bracket, and that 70 is a cut-off where you have to reapply for your driver license. So action's critical to open up the sector to younger volunteers. The age of volunteers was frequently mentioned as an issue, and also to encourage paid drivers. So we at CTA are looking to discuss this with government. Some of you may remember there was some action on this in the previous government. A private members bill was introduced, although not successfully, but we'll continue to push for that and looking to meet the Minister to discuss possibility of revised legislation. Research found that volunteer car schemes are underrepresented in the CTA membership, and that clarity on operator guidelines, and particularly for small vehicles, is required. And again, this is an area that we're looking to discuss with the Office of Traffic Commissioner and DFT to understand where we can go with operator licensing guidelines. And the third point there, 37% of operations currently use journey planning software. So the modernising for growth area had a sort of technological element, rising to 69% amongst operators with an income over 1 million per year. As you might expect, with larger organisations were more likely to have journey planning softwares. But what we did find was 17 different systems were identified, and that didn't include the bespoke ones that were being used. So it suggests that there's guidance to identify preferred suppliers or the best suppliers for CT environments, although with the proviso that we've already said that there's a variety of different CT organisations operating. Secondly, improving access to health and social care. I mentioned that health was one of the key journey purposes. So 68% of CTAs are making journeys to health-related destinations. However, only 29% are in contact with health services regularly, and only 11% receive funding from health authorities. So there's a huge disconnect there between the type of journeys that CTAs are making, and firstly the funding that's being received from health organisations, and secondly the level of contact with health authorities which is necessary, particularly around appointment times, around ensuring that access is easy for people, and it's possible to arrange journeys as well. And certainly with short notice appointments, that's a very difficult thing to manage. We have an ask in the manifesto around having coordinated points at health authorities, and we'll continue to engage with NHS England and local health authorities to make that as much as a reality as possible, to increase the opportunities for engagement locally. And 65% of CTOs feel well connected to their VCS. So we asked about connections to local transport planning, but also to local VCS. And one of our priorities within the manifesto was improved integration with social prescribing partnerships, and that connection with VCS should theoretically make that easier to achieve. However, it's also dependent on better partnerships with health trusts, who are generally the funders of social prescribing, to ensure that those CTOs are integrated into planning and receive funding for activities. So there's some engagement with CVSs, which we continue to undertake, and many CVSs are actually our members as well. But there's also sort of that engagement with health authorities. Investing in community solutions, and this is sort of more of the funding angle, if you like. And we mentioned earlier that 77% of CTOs receive grant income, and that grants are in the three highest sources of income for 81% of those organisations. So grant income is critical, but it's time limited, it's resource intensive, and it's insecure. And so funding options should allow long-term planning, reduce administration, and keep pace with inflation. So what we'll continue to do is look for more sustainable funding options from local government, but also to share good practice of sustainable funding options where we find them, to offer guidance to funders. So half of respondents disagreed that they were part of local transport decision making, and there remains a clear need for representation at local, national and regional level to ensure that local guidance includes involvement for local transport plans, bus service improvement plans, bus franchising and other transport planning. So we'll continue to work with transport authorities to identify CT opportunities within those, particularly at the moment within franchising. Some of you may have seen a new bus bill that's come out and includes a consultation element within that, which we'll be responding to, and looking at where CT can fit in best within that framework, which the government is clearly prioritising at the moment. The fourth area is community-led climate action. So in England, only 3% of identified vehicles were electric. So it's one of the key areas, I think, from the vehicle section was that there was a low take-up of electric vehicles, and that didn't appear to be gathering much force in terms of new vehicles being bought. Cost and funding issues were a major barrier for those without electric vehicles, and several comments noted that expensive EVs can appear less cost effective than cheaper ICE vehicles, or didn't fit into more dispersed rural transport services. Moreover, there were charging infrastructure issues, both at depots, if the organisation had one, or in public. So there's clear things to look at on this. We're actually planning some cross UK work to look at EV take-up and funding mechanisms. One of the findings from the Scottish report and subsequent follow-up work is that Scotland appears to have a higher take-up of EVs, and we'd certainly be keen to look at why that is the case, how that relates to other UK areas, and what particular sort of lessons can be learned to increase the level of EV take-ups where this is appropriate. I also mentioned on vehicles that there were quite a lot of older vehicles, meaning that that has potential to be charged for CASs if not exempt. But there remains a need to replace many of these older vehicles too. So it's what we saw from the vehicle purchasing results was that there was a definite uptake, as you might expect, of Euro 6 vehicles over the past 3 years in particular. So that kind of that aspect of the cleaner Euro 6 vehicle being used is improving, but the electric vehicle necessarily isn't. But we'll continue to push for continued CAS exemptions. So where most CAS exemptions are limited to 1-2 years, to 2-3 years. Sorry. So we've just been working with local authorities to ensure that those continue where they're in force currently, and we'll continue to do that, and also encourage new vehicle funding, as was clearly named as one of the 3 main priorities. And finally, delivering a fair deal for volunteers. So as I've mentioned several times already, the decline in volunteer recruitment is a factor here, and as is rising demand and the capacity of having sufficient volunteers to meet demands for services. So we'll continue to look at policy solutions in this area to remove barriers to volunteers. So, for instance, AMAP is the approved mileage, but the 45 people per mile rate basically, and D1 reform, as well as practical support for organisations to recruit and support volunteers. So it's an ongoing process there of looking at what we can do at policy, but also what we can do on a practical level to support recruitment of volunteers. So what are we going to do next? So the findings of this report are going to be serialised on a series of blogs for specific policy areas and social media over the next 2 months, taken in CT Week, which a little plug for it below there, and also going up to the National CTA Conference in November. We want to sort of drip feed these results out. You get to see the large report, but obviously that's fairly. It's a long report to read and won't be for everyone. We want to highlight areas of relevance as they come up. What these results also allow us is to do national comparisons with other CTA nations. I mentioned Scotland have done previous the state of the sector, and Wales have some results as well. Northern Ireland is currently looking at their state of the sector work. So we'll be able to do some comparisons on certain areas, and going forwards we'll be using the same question, so we'll be able to make those comparisons more more frequent. Baseline comparisons of some stats in future years. We're not necessarily looking to repeat this in the near future due to the size of the work, but some of the stats can be sort of can be checked on more frequently. So we'll be using this work as a baseline to be able to look at changes in the sector, changes in how organisations are funded, types of vehicles, etc. And finally, we have some further data collection, which we'd like to do around specific areas, perhaps to show social value, which we're looking to work with ECT on the social value toolkit to encourage take-up of that, or gather specific data in a given area. And we're open to working with local areas to gather a specific type of trip data to show what is happening in specific localities. We're also looking to do several pieces of deep dive research, some of which are in progress currently. Some of you may be looking at maybe taking part in our passenger survey, which we're doing to identify greater detail about passenger demographics, journey purposes, average spend, as well as alternative modes available. And we're coming towards the end of that. We're looking to report that in the autumn. That shows some interesting things about some further detail really behind those passenger figures that I mentioned earlier, and particularly around what people would do if they weren't travelling on community transport. And I think that's a crucial question for when looking at passengers, particularly around how CTOs do encourage people to travel who would not be able to travel otherwise. Bus franchising, again, we mentioned the bus bill that came out this week, but we're generally looking at opportunities for CTOs to engage in bus franchising or enhanced partnerships, depending on the structure used in particular areas. And volunteer car schemes, again, we mentioned that they're underrepresented, but we want to better understand the needs of these parts of the sector, and we're working with some of our stakeholders to look at the specific characteristics of this sector and the numbers involved. There's a couple of pieces of work also that we've scheduled but not necessarily started yet. We've mentioned the electric vehicle piece already. I think that would be vital to try and understand good practice from different parts of the country and also what works. Group hire is something that we have an interest in. It's the most popular service provided by CTA. It's not necessarily the biggest income generator, but it is the most popular type of service. So I think we want to be able to show the social value of this group hire, which potentially we'll be able to do through social value toolkit, and the benefits to the VCSE in local areas. It's not necessarily the largest income generator, but it does generate massive capacity for local VCSE, and that's something we want to be able to discuss. And finally, community bus routes, and this is an increasingly popular type of service, I beg your pardon. We want to see who's operating these routes and where, and are these routes replacing lost bus services, or is this feasible? We've seen a large number of the survey respondents were operating community bus routes, and we've seen an increase in the number of permits, Section 22 permits. So we want to sort of understand a little bit more about this form of transport, whether it's something that's is replacing lost bus routes in particular. So if you haven't had put your question in the comments already, please do. I'll have a look at it now. I think Sean's been keeping an eye on these, and hopefully we'll be able to go through them now. Equally, if you've had any thoughts about what you'd like to do with this work, then please do continue to put those down. If you'd like to discuss this work in any more detail, or any other element of the research at CTA, then please do contact me.